Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The following content is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute legal, psychological, or financial advice regarding family law, divorce proceedings, or domestic relations. Laws and social norms regarding marital dissolution have changed drastically over the centuries, and modern legal applications vary significantly by jurisdiction. This video is a historical analysis of social trends. Viewers are strongly encouraged to conduct their own due diligence and consult with licensed professionals regarding their specific legal or personal situations. Imagine a vast, unforgiving horizon where the wind never stops howling against the side of a sod house. In 1885, on a remote homestead in the Dakota Territory, a man sits alone. He isn't a widower and he isn't a bachelor. He is a social pariah in the eyes of the 19th century frontier, a divorced father. Today we look at the Great Plains and see the breadbasket of the world, but historically, it was the site of one of the most complex social experiments in American history. While the East Coast held on to rigid Victorian morality, the Great Plains became an accidental laboratory for the evolution of the American fatherhood dynamic. We often hear the stories of the pioneer woman or the hardy settler, but we rarely discuss the man who lost his family to the harshness of the prairie, the bottle, or the gavel. In an era where the father was legally the master of the household, how did the Great Plains become the surprising epicenter of early American divorce? And more importantly, why did the deadbeat dad trope actually find its roots in the dust of the 1930s Dust Bowl rather than the modern era? We are peeling back the layers of a century of records, from the divorced colonies of Sioux Falls to the shattered homes of the Great Depression, to understand how the identity of the Midwestern father was forged in the fire of domestic failure. If you think you know the history of the American family, the next hour will challenge everything you believe about the traditional past. By understanding the historical trajectory of divorced dads in the U.S. Great Plains, you are gaining a masterclass in the evolution of American masculinity and legal rights. This isn't just a history lesson. It is a roadmap for understanding why our current legal systems look the way they do today. For anyone navigating the complexities of modern fatherhood, or for those interested in how economic shifts dictate family survival, this deep dive provides the essential context. We are solving the mystery of the missing father in Great Plains history, showing you the potential outcomes of social isolation, and providing a data-driven look at how the Plains forced men to redefine what it meant to be a parent when the domestic hearth went cold. To truly grasp the gravity of this, we must first dismantle the myth of the unbreakable pioneer family. In the mid to late 1800s, the Great Plains were marketed as a land of renewal, but the reality was a pressure cooker for marriages. The Homestead Act of 1862 brought thousands of young families into environments of extreme isolation. In states like Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas, the distance between neighbors could be measured in miles, not feet. This isolation didn't just strain the psyche. It placed an immense burden on the father as the sole protector and provider. When the crops failed, which they did with devastating regularity due to grasshopper plagues and droughts, the traditional role of the father was decimated. Historically, the legal framework of the time was governed by fault-based divorce. To obtain a divorce in the 1870s, a parent had to prove a specific sin against their spouse: adultery, desertion, or extreme cruelty. For many fathers on the plains, the sin was often desertion, but not in the way you might think. Economic necessity often forced men to leave their families for months at a time to find work in mines or on railroads further west. When they returned, they often found that the legal definition of abandonment had been used against them. This created the first wave of divorced dads in the region, men who were effectively divorced by the land, because they could not fulfill the dual role of stationary farmer and mobile laborer. However, the Great Plains also offered a unique loophole that changed the course of American law: the divorce colony. By the 1890s, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, became the divorce capital of the United States. Because the Dakota Territory had incredibly lax residency requirements, requiring only 90 days of living in the territory before filing, men and women from across the country flocked there to dissolve their marriages. This created a peculiar class of migratory divorced dads. These were men of means who would move to the plains, live in a hotel for 3 months, secure their freedom, and often leave their children back in the East. This period marks a pivotal shift in the perception of the father. The law began to view the father not just as a permanent fixture of a household, but as an individual whose legal status could be altered by crossing state lines. We must look at the data from the 1890 census to see the ripple effect. While the national divorce rate was relatively low, the Great Plains states showed surprising spikes in non-traditional households. This was largely due to the harshness of the environment. In the late 19th century, the tender years doctrine began to take hold in frontier courts. This was the legal idea that children, particularly young ones, inherently belonged with the mother. For the Great Plains father, this was a radical and often devastating departure from the previous centuries of English common law, where fathers had near absolute rights to their children as assets of the estate. Suddenly, the Plains father found himself in a position where he was expected to provide financial support through alimony or child maintenance, concepts that were still in their infancy, while having very little right to see his children in a sod-built home that the court deemed unfit for a single man. As we move toward the turn of the century, the narrative of the divorced dad in the Midwest becomes intertwined with the rise of industrialization. In the early 1900s, as the golden age of agriculture hit the plains, the stakes for divorce rose. Land was becoming more valuable. A divorce didn't just mean the end of a marriage. It meant the partitioning of a homestead. We see case studies in Nebraska court records from 1905 where fathers fought bitterly not just for their children, but for the right to remain on the land they had cleared. This era introduced the collusive divorce, where fathers and mothers would mutually agree to lie about cruelty, just to escape the isolation of the plains, often resulting in a generation of children raised in split households long before it was socially acceptable in the cities of the East. The psychological impact on these men was documented in the journals of early rural doctors. They described a prairie madness that affected divorced men, a deep sense of failure that was both economic and patriarchal. In a society that measured a man's worth by the straightness of his furrows and the size of his brood, being a divorced dad was a mark of absolute incompetence. This historical trend suggests that the shame associated with divorce was actually more intense in the Great Plains than in urban centers like New York or Chicago, because in a small farming community, your business was everyone's business. There was no fresh start in a town of 200 people. You were simply the man whose wife had left for the city, or the man who couldn't keep his house in order. This forced many fathers into a life of transience, moving from one harvest to the next, becoming the hired hand on other men's farms, forever separated from the legacies they tried to build. This sets the stage for the massive upheaval of the 1930s, where the environmental collapse of the Dust Bowl would turn these individual tragedies into a regional epidemic. To understand the sheer magnitude of the crisis that hit the Great Plains in the 1930s, we have to look past the iconic black and white photos of swirling dust and look into the ledger books of rural county courthouses. When the topsoil began to lift off the earth in Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, the traditional family structure didn't just bend. It shattered. Imagine a father named John in 1934. John has spent 15 years building a life on 160 acres of Oklahoma Panhandle soil. He has a wife and 4 children. Suddenly, the rain stops. Then the wind starts. For years, he watches his net worth literally blow into the next county. In this moment, John is facing more than just an environmental disaster. He is facing a total collapse of his identity as a provider. This was the era where the term desertion took on a terrifying new scale in the American heartland. Historical trends from the 1930s indicate that divorce rates actually dipped slightly during the height of the Great Depression, but not because marriages were happy. It was because divorce was a luxury no one could afford. Filing fees, lawyer retainers, and the division of property were impossible when the property was worthless. Instead, what we saw across the Great Plains was the rise of the poor man's divorce. Abandonment. Thousands of fathers simply walked away. They didn't do it out of malice but out of a crushing sense of shame. If they couldn't feed their children, they felt their presence was a burden rather than a benefit. This created a massive undocumented population of divorced dads who were legally married but functionally absent, wandering the rail lines of the Midwest in search of any labor that could provide a few dollars to send back home. Let us look at a specific case study from the Texas Panhandle in 1936. Court records from the time show a massive spike in non-support filings. This was the precursor to modern child support enforcement. A father would leave for the California fruit orchards, promising to send money back. Months would pass with no word. The mother, with a failing farm and hungry children, would file for a legal separation to qualify for new federal relief programs like the Works Progress Administration. For the father, the potential outcome was a life of permanent displacement. He became a ghost in his own family history. In 1930s Great Plains culture, a man who left was often viewed with more vitriol than a man who died. A widow was a tragic figure. A woman whose husband had vanished into the dust was a social failure. Step by step, the legal system had to adapt to this regional epidemic. Before the 1930s, if a father moved to a different state, he was effectively untouchable regarding his domestic obligations. However, the sheer volume of displaced fathers from the Great Plains forced the federal government to begin looking at uniform laws. We started to see the early blueprints of what would eventually become the Uniform Reciprocal Enforcement of Support Act. The Great Plains Divorce Act of 1935 was the reason the government began to realize that family law could no longer be purely local. When a father from Kansas ended up in a Hooverville in Seattle, the legal threads connecting him to his children back on the prairie were being stretched to the breaking point. Now imagine if John, our Oklahoma father, actually tried to stay. The economic pressure created a different kind of domestic friction. Historical records suggest that domestic violence and alcoholism spiked in the Great Plains during the Dust Bowl years, as a direct result of the loss of patriarchal agency. When the land failed, the father failed in the eyes of 18th and 19th century gender norms. This led to a wave of contested divorces where the grounds were often habitual drunkenness or extreme cruelty. In these cases, the Great Plains courts began to favor the mother with an almost religious zeal. The father was seen as the one who brought the family to this desolate place and then failed to sustain them. This era solidified the archetype of the Midwestern father as a stern, distant, and often broken figure, a man who was physically present but emotionally divorced from the family unit long before any legal papers were signed. By 1938, as the rain slowly returned, the social landscape of the plains had been permanently altered. The fathers who returned found that their children had grown up in a world where the father figure was associated with scarcity and abandonment. This created a generational trauma that influenced how those children, particularly the sons, would later approach their own marriages in the post-World War II era. We see a direct line from the Dust Bowl abandonment to the rigid, work-obsessed fatherhood of the 1950s. These men were determined never to let the land or the economy take their status again, leading to an era of overcorrection where the father became the stoic, unmoving pillar of the home, often at the expense of any emotional connection. Consider the data on migratory labor. During the 1930s, nearly 2.5 million people left the Great Plains. A significant portion of these were men traveling alone. In cities like Wichita or Omaha, social workers reported thousands of cases where fathers were living in boarding houses, sending 60% of their meager wages back to a family they hadn't seen in 2 years. Were these men divorced? Technically, no. But socially and psychologically, they were the first mass wave of the long-distance dad. They were navigating a proto-version of joint custody, managed not by courts, but by the Postal Service. The emotional toll of this can be seen in the letters archived by historical societies in Nebraska and South Dakota. Fathers would write meticulously detailed instructions on how to plant the garden or fix the roof, desperately trying to maintain their role as the head of the household from 1,000 miles away. This brings us to the mid-century shift. As the United States entered 1941 and the war effort began, the Great Plains father was suddenly in demand again. The transition from the broken Dust Bowl dad to the heroic soldier, or the high-output industrial farmer, happened almost overnight. But the scars of the 1930s divorce epidemic remained. The legal system had become more streamlined, and the social stigma of the man who left had been codified into law. For the first time, we began to see the state take an active role in the collection of funds from absent fathers, a trend that started in the grain belts and cattle towns of the Midwest before spreading to the coastal cities. The Great Plains father of the mid-20th century was caught between two worlds: the rugged individualism of the pioneer past and the bureaucratic reality of the modern state. He was expected to be the master of his domain, but he was now living in a world where the court could take his land, his wages, and his access to his children with increasing efficiency. This period represents the birth of the modern family court struggle as we know it today. The tensions were simmering under the surface of the prosperous 1950s, waiting for the cultural revolution of the 1960s and 70s to explode. But what happened when the law finally caught up with the reality of unhappy marriages? As we move into the next phase of this deep dive, we have to look at the 1960s, the era of the Great Transition. The Great Plains, long known for its conservative values, was about to face a tidal wave of no-fault divorce laws that would redefine the role of the father yet again. How did a region built on the idea of the permanent homestead react when the law suddenly made it possible to walk away without a single reason? And how did the fathers of the 1970s plains find themselves in a battle for something their grandfathers had taken for granted? the right to be more than just a paycheck? The answer lies in a series of landmark cases that started in the smallest towns of Kansas and ended up changing the face of American fatherhood forever. The transition into the 1960s and 1970s across the Great Plains represents one of the most jarring cultural pivots in the history of the American male. To understand this, imagine a father named Michael in 1972, living in a small community outside of Lincoln, Nebraska. Michael grew up watching his father endure the silent, stoic aftermath of the Great Depression. For Michael's generation, marriage was framed as an unbreakable covenant, not just of the spirit but of the soil. In the Great Plains, your identity was tied to your neighbor's perception of your stability, but the legal landscape was shifting beneath Michael's feet. In 1969, California had passed the first no-fault divorce law, and like a weather system moving across the prairie, those legislative changes were heading straight for the heartland. Before this era, a father in Kansas or North Dakota generally only faced divorce if there was a catastrophic moral failure. Historical trends show that the legal bar was so high that many men stayed in deeply fractured homes, simply because the court would not grant a decree without proof of a specific crime or sin. But as the 1970s progressed, Great Plains states began adopting versions of no-fault statutes. This meant that for the first time in history, Michael's wife could walk into a courthouse and end the marriage because of irreconcilable differences. For the Great Plains father, this was a total destabilization of his world. He could be a provider, a hard worker, and a law-abiding citizen, yet still find himself ousted from his home and separated from his children without having committed a single legal infraction. This era gave birth to a specific type of case study we see repeated in rural appellate courts throughout the mid-1970s. Take, for example, the struggle over the family farm. In the Great Plains, assets are often illiquid. You might be land-rich but cash-poor. When no-fault divorce hit these agricultural hubs, the potential outcomes were often devastating for the paternal lineage. If a court ordered a 50-50 split of assets, it often meant the father had to sell a portion of the land that had been in his family for 3 generations just to pay out a settlement. This led to a rise in what historians call the displaced farmer dad. These were men who lost their vocation and their family unit simultaneously. The psychological impact of losing the land, which was seen as the father's primary legacy for his children, created a unique form of regional depression that social workers in states like Iowa and Nebraska began to document with increasing concern. Step by step, the 1970s also saw the solidification of the tender years doctrine into a more modern, yet still heavily biased best interests of the child standard. While the language sounded neutral, in the conservative pockets of the Great Plains, the application remained traditional. Mothers were almost universally granted primary physical custody, while fathers were relegated to the role of the visitor. Imagine the logistical nightmare of a 1976 divorce, in a region where the next town is 40 miles away. A father who was granted every other weekend visitation often found himself driving hundreds of miles on gravel roads just to spend 48 hours in a cramped apartment or a roadside motel with children who now viewed him as an outsider. This geographical reality of the Great Plains made the divorced dad experience significantly more isolating than that of his urban counterparts. During this time, the rise of the secondary household became a new feature of the Midwestern landscape. In small towns, you started to see the emergence of bachelor apartments above Main Street businesses, populated almost entirely by divorced men who were trying to stay close to their kids. This created a new social class. These men were no longer part of the Friday night high school football crowd in the same way. They were the men sitting alone at the diner, checking their watches, waiting for their scheduled time. Data from the late 1970s indicates that the suicide rate for middle-aged men in rural Great Plains counties began to climb, often correlated with the loss of domestic roles. The father was told by society to be the rock, but the law had made the ground beneath that rock remarkably fluid. We also have to consider the economic shift of the late 1970s farm crisis, which acted as a catalyst for these divorces. As interest rates plummeted and then spiked, and as land values fluctuated wildly, the financial stress on Great Plains households reached a breaking point. Case studies from this period show that financial insolvency was the leading indicator of marital collapse in rural areas. For the father, the failure of the farm was seen as a personal failure of his masculinity. When the divorce followed the foreclosure, many men experienced a total erasure of their social standing. This was the moment when the weekend dad trope truly took hold in the American psyche. The father was no longer the man who taught his son how to run the combine. He was the man who took his son to the movies in the city once every 14 days. By the time we hit 1980, the Great Plains was littered with the remnants of these shattered traditionalist dreams. The legal system had become a factory for child support orders, but it had yet to develop a framework for meaningful joint physical custody. The 1980s would eventually bring the rise of fathers' rights groups, many of which found their most fervent members in the Midwest. These were men who were tired of being treated as walking ATMs and wanted a return to a more active parenting role. They were fighting against a system that they felt had used the new no-fault laws to strip them of their rights while keeping their obligations fully intact. Now, think about the children of these 1970s divorces. They were the first generation in the Great Plains to grow up in a world where two homes were a common reality. This shifted the cultural expectations of the entire region. The rugged, unbreakable family unit of the pioneer days was officially a thing of the past. But as the 1980s approached, a new conflict was brewing. The government was getting more aggressive about child support enforcement, and the technology of the era, early computer databases, was beginning to make it impossible for the disappearing dad to stay hidden. The next decade would see the introduction of wage garnishment and the federalization of child support, turning the Great Plains divorced dad into a subject of intense state scrutiny. How did these men react when the government started reaching directly into their weekly paychecks before they even saw the money? And what happened when the farm crisis of the 1980s collided with these new, aggressive legal mandates? We are about to look at the era of the Reagan-era heartland, where the intersection of a collapsing agricultural economy and a surging legal bureaucracy created a perfect storm for the American father. The struggle was no longer just between a man and his ex-wife. It was now a man against the state, in a battle for his very survival. The transition into the 1980s across the Great Plains felt like a localized apocalypse for the traditional agrarian family. To understand the gravity of this period, imagine a father named David in 1984, living near the border of Iowa and South Dakota. David is a second-generation corn farmer. He is currently facing a triple threat. Interest rates for his farm equipment have soared to 18%. His land value has plummeted by 40% in 36 months, and his wife has just filed for divorce. In the 1950s, David would have had the community's support. In the 1980s, David is a liability. This was the era of the farm crisis, a historical trend that served as a massive catalyst for the fragmentation of the Great Plains fatherhood experience. The 1980s marked the first time that the United States government moved from being a passive observer of divorce to an active enforcer of its financial aftermath. Before this decade, child support was largely a private matter handled by local county sheriffs, who rarely had the resources to track a father across state lines. But in 1984, the federal child support enforcement amendments were passed. This was a turning point. It required states to improve their collection procedures, specifically by introducing mandatory wage garnishment. For a father on the Great Plains, this changed the very nature of his labor. Imagine if David, after losing his farm, takes a job at a local meatpacking plant in Sioux City. For the first time in his life, he does not receive his full paycheck. The state has already taken its cut before the envelope reaches his hand. This created a profound sense of emasculation among rural men who had been raised on the ethos of self-reliance and the sanctity of the private wage. Historical trends during this period show that the Great Plains had some of the highest rates of agricultural foreclosure in the nation, which directly correlated with the surge in domestic litigation. Case studies from Nebraska in 1985 highlight a recurring tragedy: the double loss. Fathers were appearing in court to argue that their child support obligations should be lowered because their income had vanished along with their livestock. However, the legal system was often slow to react to the volatility of the farm economy. Judges, operating under new federal pressure to ensure children did not become a burden on the state welfare system, often set support amounts based on a father's earning potential rather than his actual current income. This led to a phenomenon known as the debt trap. A father would fall behind on payments during a bad harvest year, and under the newly established Bradley Amendment of 1986, those arrears could not be retroactively reduced. Even if David eventually found a way to get back on his feet, he was now carrying a debt to the state that carried interest rates and penalties that made it nearly impossible to ever clear. The pressure of this legal bureaucracy led to the rise of the first organized fathers' rights movements in the Midwest. These were not just social clubs, they were survival networks. In basement meetings from Fargo to Wichita, men traded legal strategies on how to maintain a relationship with their children when they could no longer afford the lifestyle their children were accustomed to. The 1880s father fought the wind and the grasshoppers, the 1980s father fought the computer database. This decade saw the introduction of the Federal Parent Locator Service. For the first time, the vastness of the Great Plains offered no protection for the father who wanted to disappear and start over. Every Social Security number was a beacon. While this was a victory for the financial stability of many single-mother households, the potential outcomes for the fathers often included a total withdrawal from social life due to the shame of being labeled a deadbeat in a culture that still valued the appearance of the intact family. Step by step, the 1980s also saw the psychological fracturing of the Midwestern male identity. In the past, the Great Plains father was defined by what he built. In the 1980s, he was increasingly defined by what he owed. We see this reflected in the cultural output of the time, from the lyrics of Bruce Springsteen to the films like Country or The River, which often depicted the father as a man under siege by banks and bureaucrats. For the divorced dad, this siege was doubled. He was fighting the bank to keep his equipment and fighting the court to keep his visitation rights. Imagine the logistical strain of trying to maintain a relationship with a child while your primary vehicle is being repossessed. The Great Plains, with its lack of public transportation and vast distances between rural homesteads and town-based apartments, became a geographical prison for the low-income divorced father. Data from 1988 suggests that the stress of these combined factors led to a significant increase in rural health crises. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the loss of the future. In the Great Plains, land was the bridge between a father and his son. When the land was sold off in a divorce settlement or a foreclosure, that bridge was burned. The father no longer had a legacy to pass down, which historically had been the primary motivator for the grueling work of prairie farming. This led to a generation of fathers who felt like ghosts in their own lineages. They were the men who worked the late shifts at the grain elevators, living in trailers on the edge of town, watching their former lives continue without them through the window of a dusty pickup truck. By the end of the 1980s, the legal system had become much more efficient at collecting money, but it remained remarkably inefficient at ensuring parental access. The Great Plains courts were still heavily favoring the primary caregiver model, which almost always meant the mother. This created a deep-seated resentment that would define the gender politics of the region for the next 30 years. The 1980s divorced dad was the first to realize that the law viewed his role as primarily financial. If he couldn't pay, his access was often informally restricted by a system that didn't see the value of a broke father. This era solidified the belief among many Midwestern men that the family court system was an extension of the same urban, bureaucratic machine that had destroyed the small family farm. But as we turn the corner into the 1990s, the narrative begins to shift again. The economy started to stabilize, and a new generation of fathers, the sons of those who were broken in the 80s, started to demand a different kind of deal. They weren't just looking for lower payments, they were looking for 50-50 custody. They were the ones who would start the push for the joint custody revolution that would eventually sweep across the plains. But this wasn't going to be an easy fight. It was going to require a total reevaluation of what a father's time was worth compared to a father's money. In the next part, we dive into the 1990s, the era of the custody wars. We will look at how the Great Plains became the unlikely birthplace of the shared parenting movement, and how the rise of the internet allowed these isolated fathers to unite and change the laws of their states. How did the digital age turn a lonely farmer in Kansas into a legal activist? And what happened when the courts finally had to answer the question, is a father's presence more valuable than his paycheck? The answer would lead to a landmark shift in the very definition of the American family. The 1990s dawned over the Great Plains not with the sound of tractors, but with the clicking of keyboards in dim home offices from Bismarck to Abilene. This decade represented a fundamental rewiring of how the divorced father navigated his reality. To understand this shift, imagine a father named Robert in 1994, living in a small town in western Kansas. Robert is a mechanic. He is part of the first generation of fathers who grew up seeing the fallout of the 1970s no-fault revolution and the 1980s farm crisis. He is divorced, and like those before him, he has been granted the standard visitation schedule of every other weekend and one evening a week. But Robert is different. He has access to an early internet service provider, and for the first time in human history, he realizes he is not an island. He finds message boards filled with thousands of other men in Nebraska, Wyoming, and Colorado who are all asking the same question. Why am I a guest in my child's life? This was the birth of the shared parenting movement in the American heartland. Historically, the Great Plains had been a bastion of the primary caretaker model, which almost exclusively favored mothers. However, the 1890s saw a surge in legislative lobbying led by these newly connected fathers. They began to challenge the very premise of the best interests of the child standard. They argued that the potential outcomes for children without significant paternal involvement included higher rates of truancy, substance abuse, and emotional instability. Case studies from the Kansas State Legislature in 1995 show that fathers were no longer just complaining about the money they owed. They were presenting sociological data. They were moving the conversation from a battle of the sexes to a battle for child development. Step by step, the legal system began to feel the pressure of this organized front. In the mid-90s, we began to see the introduction of rebuttable presumptions for joint custody in several Midwestern states. This was a massive legal pivot. It meant that the court would start with the assumption that 50-50 shared parenting was the best option, and the burden of proof shifted to the parent who wanted to limit the other's time. For a father like Robert in Kansas, this was revolutionary. It meant he no longer had to prove he was a hero to see his kids. His ex-wife had to prove he was a danger to keep them away. However, the implementation was messy. Rural judges, many of whom had been on the bench since the 1970s, were often resistant to these new guidelines. They still viewed the father as the provider and the mother as the nurturer, a cultural relic of the pioneer days that was hard to scrub away from the prairie psyche. The 1990s also introduced a new economic reality for the divorced dad: the rise of the service economy in the Great Plains. As small-scale farming continued to consolidate into massive corporate operations, more fathers moved into town to work in retail, manufacturing, or telecommunications. This geographic shift actually helped the cause of shared parenting. It is much easier to facilitate a 50-50 custody split when both parents live within 5 miles of each other in a town like Grand Island, Nebraska, than it is when they are separated by 50 miles of dirt roads. The logistical barriers of the 1930s and 1970s were dissolving. Data from the late 1990s suggests that as fathers moved into more urbanized environments within the Great Plains, their participation in daily activities and extracurriculars increased by over 30% compared to the previous decade. But with increased access came increased scrutiny. The 1990s saw the federal government double down on the enforcement mechanisms created in the 1980s. The Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996, often called welfare reform, had a massive impact on Great Plains fathers. It required states to have automated systems for child support enforcement and mandated the revocation of professional and driver's licenses for non-payment. Imagine if Robert, our Kansas mechanic, falls behind on his payments because the local garage closes down. Under the new 1996 rules, the state could take his driver's license. In the Great Plains, where there is no subway and no bus line, taking a man's license is effectively taking his ability to ever pay the debt. This created a paradoxical trap that many men called the rural death spiral. You cannot work without a truck, and you cannot have a truck without a license, but you cannot have a license without the money you can't earn because you don't have the truck. Historical trends during the late 90s show that this led to a significant underground economy. Thousands of divorced dads in states like North Dakota and South Dakota began working for cash under the table to avoid garnishments that they felt were calculated at unsustainable levels. This wasn't just about greed, it was about survival. If a man had a second family, which many did, he was often caught in a zero-sum game between his first set of children and his current household. This period saw the emergence of the complex blended family as a standard feature of the Midwestern landscape. The holidays became a logistical military operation of driving between towns, managing step-siblings, and navigating the lingering resentments of the 1980s farm failures. The 1990s also saw a shift in how the media portrayed the Great Plains father. We moved away from the stoic farmer of the Dust Bowl and toward the struggling, often well-meaning but bumbling suburban rural dad. This cultural shift reflected a deeper truth. The Great Plains was losing its unique frontier identity and becoming more like the rest of America. The problems of the divorced dad in Omaha were now the same as the problems of the divorced dad in Atlanta. The isolation of the prairie was being replaced by the isolation of the cubicle. Yet, the legal statutes in these states remain some of the most conservative in the country, creating a friction point that would define the next 30 years of family law. One overlooked aspect of this era is the role of the military. The Great Plains has always had a high rate of military enlistment per capita. In the 1990s, with various overseas deployments, many divorced dads found themselves trying to maintain custody rights while being deployed. This led to specific legislative changes in states like Nebraska to protect the parenting time of service members. It was the first time the law recognized that a father's absence wasn't always a choice or a failing, but a sacrifice. This helped soften the deadbeat dad image and replaced it with the idea of the long-distance parent, who is still emotionally invested. As we move toward the year 2000, we see a landscape that has been completely terraformed. The Great Plains father is no longer the undisputed king of his castle, nor is he the vanished ghost of the 1930s. He is a man in the middle of a bureaucratic and social transition. He is fighting for his right to be a parent in a system that was built to see him only as a financial resource. He has the tools of the internet to organize, the proximity of the town to facilitate visits, but he still carries the weight of a century of social stigma. But a new challenge was on the horizon. The 2000s would bring the housing bubble, the Great Recession, and a new technological revolution that would change the very definition of presence. What happens when a father can see his kids every night through a screen, but can't afford the gas to drive to their house? How did the rise of the opioid crisis in the rural Midwest add a terrifying new layer to the custody battles of the new millennium? The next chapter of this deep dive takes us into the 21st century, where the ghost of the pioneer father meets the reality of the digital age. The stakes were about to get much higher, and the definition of a family would be pushed to its absolute breaking point. Entering the early 2000s, the Great Plains landscape underwent a digital and economic transformation that fundamentally altered the fatherhood dynamic. To see this change in action, imagine a father named Stephen in 2004, living in a small cattle town in western Nebraska. Stephen represents the first generation of Great Plains dads for whom the physical distance of the prairie was bridged by the first iterations of high-speed internet and the proliferation of the cellular phone. Historically, if a father in the 1970s was 30 miles away, he was effectively in another world. For Stephen, the distance was still there, but the digital tether had arrived. However, this tether was a double-edged sword. It allowed for more frequent contact, but it also became a new tool for surveillance and legal conflict in an era where family law was struggling to keep pace with technology. This period marked the beginning of what historians and legal analysts call the virtual visitation era. In states like North Dakota and Kansas, lawmakers began debating whether a video call constituted a visit. For a divorced dad on the Great Plains, where winter blizzards can shut down Interstate 80 for days, the potential outcomes of these early digital tools were life-changing. If Stephen couldn't drive through 6 inches of snow to pick up his daughter for his scheduled weekend, he could now, for the first time, see her face through a grainy webcam. But the legal friction arose when custodial parents argued that digital time should replace physical time, rather than supplement it. We see case studies in the early 2000s Nebraska appellate courts where fathers fought tooth and nail against the idea that a screen was an adequate substitute for a hug. They argued that the Great Plains fatherhood identity was rooted in shared activity, fixing a fence, attending a 4-H meeting, or driving a tractor, none of which could be digitized. As the decade progressed, the 2008 financial crisis hit the heartland with a different kind of force than the coastal regions. While the housing bubble didn't burst quite as spectacularly in the Great Plains as it did in Florida or Nevada, the tightening of credit markets strangled the agricultural sector and the small businesses that supported it. For the divorced dad, this meant that the financial order set in the relatively prosperous early 2000s suddenly became impossible to meet. Historical trends show a massive spike in modification filings between 2008 and 2011 across the Midwest. A father who was ordered to pay child support based on his 2005 income found himself in a terrifying position when his construction job in Wichita or his grain transport business in Des Moines evaporated. Step by step, we saw the legal system move toward a more punitive stance on arrears during this economic contraction. The 2000s were the decade of the automated enforcement system, reaching its peak efficiency. State governments, facing their own budget shortfalls, became more aggressive in intercepting federal tax refunds and seizing bank accounts. For a man like Stephen, who was already struggling to pay for the gas required for a 200-mile round trip to see his kids, the seizure of a tax refund meant the difference between making his visitation or staying home in a dark apartment. This created a new class of father, the economically stranded dad. He was legally allowed to see his children, but physically and financially unable to reach them. This era saw the rise of the visitation desert, where rural fathers in the vast stretches of the Dakotas and Wyoming simply stopped showing up because the cost of the trip exceeded their weekly grocery budget. The 2000s also introduced a darker element to the Great Plains narrative, the beginning of the rural opioid and methamphetamine epidemic. To understand the impact of this on divorced dads, we have to look at how custody battles shifted from being about time and money to being about safety and sobriety. Case studies from rural Oklahoma and Kansas in 2007 show a disturbing trend of cross-accusations. In the hyper-connected small-town atmosphere of the Great Plains, a single rumor of drug use could lead to an emergency ex parte order that stripped a father of his rights for months while he waited for a court date. Because rural counties often had only one judge who traveled between several towns, the wait for justice was long. For many fathers, this meant missing entire seasons of their children's lives based on accusations that were often difficult to disprove in a timely manner. Despite these challenges, the 2000s also saw the maturation of the fatherhood advocacy groups that had started in the 90s. These organizations became more sophisticated, moving away from protest and toward professional lobbying. In 2006 and 2007, we saw significant pushes in state legislatures across the Great Plains for mandatory parenting classes for all divorcing couples. These classes were designed to mitigate the damage of high-conflict separations. For the Great Plains dad, these classes were often the first time anyone had sat him down and explained that his role as a parent was distinct from his role as a former husband. This was a crucial psychological shift. It began to dismantle the old 1930s style shame. The message was changing. You are not a failure because your marriage ended. You are a success if you stay involved in your child's life. By 2009, the technological landscape had shifted again with the rise of the smartphone. This changed the logistics of the divorced dad in real time. Shared calendars, instant messaging, and GPS tracking became part of the everyday vocabulary of the Great Plains family. Imagine if Stephen could now track his daughter's school bus in real time, or receive an instant notification about a parent-teacher conference. The gatekeeping that had been common in the 1970s and 80s, where one parent held all the information, was becoming harder to maintain. Information was now decentralized. This empowered the Great Plains father to be a more active participant in the minutiae of his children's lives, even if he didn't have primary physical custody. However, this increased connectivity also led to a new phenomenon: the documented dad. Every text message, every missed call, and every social media post became potential evidence in a custody hearing. The Great Plains father, who historically valued his privacy and his word of honor, found himself living in a digital fishbowl. One frustrated text sent at 2 a.m. could be printed out and presented in a courtroom in Pierre or Topeka as proof of an unstable temperament. The potential outcomes of this digital paper trail were often permanent. It forced a new kind of disciplined behavior on men who were used to the more informal, handshake-based social contracts of the rural past. The end of the 2000s left the Great Plains divorced dad in a state of suspended animation. He had more tools than ever to stay connected, yet he faced more aggressive state enforcement and more complex social challenges than his father ever had. The Great Recession had left him financially scarred, and the legal system, while moving toward the idea of joint custody, was still anchored by old-school prejudices in many rural jurisdictions. He was a man caught between the rugged independence of the pioneer myth and the reality of being a data point in a state-run collection and visitation system. But the most significant shift was yet to come. As we move into the 2010s, the Great Plains would see a legislative revolution that would finally codify the 50-50 split as the default starting point. We are about to look at how a group of determined fathers in Kentucky, and then the Midwest, took their fight all the way to the governor's desks, fundamentally changing the laws of the land. And we will explore how the rise of the gig economy and the remote work revolution would finally solve the geographical problem that had plagued the Great Plains father since the days of the sod house. What happens when the father can take his job with him? And how did the 2010s finally start to heal the generational rift that began in the Dust Bowl? The era of the equal parent was finally within reach, but the battle for the hearts and minds of the community was only just beginning. The 2010s arrived with a legislative thunderclap that began to dismantle the architectural bias of the previous century. To grasp the intensity of this decade, imagine a father named Marcus in 2015, living in a suburban rural hybrid community outside of Oklahoma City. Marcus represents the tipping point. Unlike his grandfather in the 1930s who vanished into the dust, or his father in the 1980s who was buried under foreclosure and wage garnishment, Marcus is part of a movement that is no longer asking for permission to be a parent. He is demanding that the law reflect the biological and social reality of fatherhood. In 2015, the Great Plains was no longer just a collection of farming states. It was becoming a legal battleground for the shared parenting revolution. Historical trends in the early 2010s show that the Great Plains states were among the first to see a surge in organized legislative advocacy. In states like South Dakota and Nebraska, fathers' rights organizations transitioned from fringe support groups into sophisticated political action committees. They focused on a single powerful concept: the rebuttable presumption of equal shared parenting. This was the idea that 50-50 custody should be the starting point of every divorce case, rather than a goal that fathers had to fight years to achieve. Case studies from the 2014 South Dakota legislative session show a dramatic shift in testimony. Fathers were no longer just sharing personal grievances. They were bringing in child psychologists and sociologists who presented data suggesting that the potential outcomes for children in shared parenting arrangements included higher self-esteem and better academic performance. Step by step, we saw this advocacy turn into hard law. South Dakota became a pioneer in 2014, passing legislation that encouraged judges to grant joint physical custody. This was followed by a wave of similar movements across the Great Plains. For a father like Marcus, this meant that the court was finally moving away from the every other weekend model. But the pushback was immense. We must look at the opposition from various legal bar associations and domestic violence advocacy groups during this time. They argued that mandatory 50-50 splits could put children at risk in high-conflict situations. The compromise that emerged in the Great Plains was a refined legal standard, where the presumption could only be overturned by clear and convincing evidence of harm. This was a monumental shift in the burden of proof. For over a century, the Great Plains father had to prove why he should be involved. Now the system was finally starting to ask why he shouldn't be. The 2010s also introduced the gig economy and the remote work revolution to the heartland, which solved a geographical problem that had plagued the region since the 1800s. Historically, a divorce in a small town often meant one parent had to move to the city for work, effectively ending the daily parenting relationship. But by 2016, the expansion of rural broadband meant that a father in western Kansas could work for a tech firm in Denver or a logistics company in Kansas City without leaving his community. This economic flexibility allowed divorced dads to maintain households in close proximity to their children's schools. Imagine the impact. Marcus no longer has to choose between a career and his kids. He can coach the Little League team at 4 p.m. because he finished his remote data entry tasks at 3:30 p.m. This began to heal the generational rift of the long-distance dad that had been a staple of Great Plains life since the Dust Bowl. However, the 2010s also brought the peak of the opioid crisis to rural America, creating a new and devastating obstacle for many fathers. In states like Oklahoma and Missouri, the data from 2017 indicates that a significant percentage of custody disputes involved at least one parent struggling with substance abuse. For the divorced dad, this meant the legal battle often shifted from time-sharing to rescue operations. We see countless case studies from this era where fathers, after years of being sidelined by the courts, were suddenly called upon to take full custody because the mother had fallen victim to the addiction epidemic. This forced a rapid maturation of the legal support systems for fathers. Men who had been told for decades that they were secondary caregivers were suddenly the primary shield for their children against a regional health crisis. As we moved toward 2018, the Great Plains also saw the rise of the fatherhood program as a state-funded initiative. States like Nebraska began investing in programs designed to help non-custodial fathers re-enter their children's lives after long absences. These weren't just about child support collection, they were about relationship building. They provided mediation, job training, and parenting classes specifically tailored to the Midwestern male psyche. The focus was on restoring the father's sense of agency. This era marked the beginning of the end for the deadbeat dad trope in the Great Plains. The narrative was shifting toward the undersupported dad. The state was starting to realize that a father who is emotionally invested is a father who is more likely to be financially stable and compliant with support orders. The social media landscape of the late 2010s also played a crucial role in this historical overview. Groups on platforms like Facebook allowed fathers in the Great Plains to share real-time information about specific judges and attorneys. This crowdsourcing of legal intelligence meant that a father in a small town wasn't just relying on whatever lawyer was on the corner of Main Street. He had the collective wisdom of thousands of other men who had navigated the same courtrooms. This transparency began to erode the localized biases that had existed in rural family courts for decades. Judges knew that their rulings were being discussed and analyzed in public forums, leading to a more standardized application of the new shared parenting laws. Consider the data on the decline of the traditional litigation model. By 2019, mediation had become the preferred method for resolving custody disputes in the Great Plains. Fathers were choosing to sit across a table, and negotiate their roles rather than let a judge in a black robe decide their fate. This move toward collaborative law was a direct reflection of the changing values of the region. The pioneer spirit of rugged individualism was being replaced by a more pragmatic, community-focused approach to family dissolution. The goal was no longer to win the divorce, but to survive the aftermath with the family's future intact. By the time we reached the end of the decade, the Great Plains had become one of the most progressive regions in the country regarding fathers' rights, a total reversal from its Victorian-era roots. The fathers who came of age in the 2010s were the first in history to enter the family court system with a reasonable expectation of equal time. They were the first to benefit from the digital economy's ability to erase distance. And they were the first to see the state move from an adversary to a cautious partner in the parenting process. The ghosts of the 1930s abandonment and the 1980s foreclosure were finally being laid to rest by a generation that refused to be silenced. But as the world turned toward 2020, an unprecedented global event was about to put these new shared parenting laws and digital bridges to the ultimate test. The arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic would create a set of circumstances that no Great Plains lawmaker could have imagined. How would a 50-50 custody split work when the state borders were closing and schools were moving to the kitchen table? What happens when a father's visitation is suddenly labeled as non-essential travel? We are about to dive into the most volatile 4-year period in the history of the American family. The pandemic didn't just test the legal system. It revealed the true strength of the bonds that these Great Plains fathers had fought for over the last century. The struggle for presence was about to become a struggle for health, safety, and the very survival of the co-parenting relationship. The year 2020 served as a stress test for the legal and social infrastructure of the Great Plains, a region where the physical distance between households was already a significant hurdle. To understand the chaos of this period, imagine a father named Brian in April 2020, living in a small town in North Dakota. Brian works for an energy company and shares 50-50 custody of his 2 sons with his ex-wife, who lives 75 miles away across the state line in Minnesota. Suddenly, the world stops. State governors are issuing stay-at-home orders, and the very act of driving his children back and forth for their weekly transition is being questioned by local law enforcement. For Brian, the struggle for presence was no longer a philosophical or legal debate. It was a matter of navigating a global health crisis, while maintaining the bond he had spent years fighting to establish in court. This era introduced a massive conflict between public health mandates and family court orders. In the early months of the pandemic, many custodial parents in the Great Plains attempted to use the lockdowns as a reason to suspend visitation. They argued that moving children between 2 households increased the risk of exposure. However, the Supreme Courts of states like Kansas and Nebraska were remarkably proactive. They issued emergency administrative orders stating clearly that COVID-19 was not a valid reason to deny parenting time. Historical trends from 2020 show that these courts viewed the parent-child relationship as an essential service. This was a monumental victory for the status of the Great Plains father. It signaled that even in a state of emergency, the father's right to be present was not a secondary luxury, but a fundamental necessity. Case studies from the Omaha and Wichita court systems in late 2020 highlight the rise of the digital schoolhouse as a new arena for paternal involvement. Because schools moved to remote learning, many fathers who previously had little insight into their children's daily education suddenly became part-time teachers. Imagine Brian, our North Dakota father, sitting at his kitchen table helping his son with a Zoom math class while simultaneously managing his own remote work. This period forced a rapid acceleration of the trend we saw in the 1990s, the erasure of the gatekeeper. Fathers now had direct access to teachers, school portals, and daily curriculum without needing to go through the other parent. The potential outcomes of this forced proximity were a deeper understanding of the child's developmental needs and a permanent shift in the division of domestic labor. However, the economic impact of the pandemic created a secondary crisis for the Great Plains divorced dad. While the agricultural sector remained essential, the surrounding service industries and small-town businesses faced a brutal contraction. Data from 2021 indicates a massive spike in petitions for child support abatement. Fathers who had built stable lives in the 2010s found their income streams dried up overnight. Unlike the 1980s farm crisis, where the state was often slow and punitive, the 2020 to 2021 period saw a slight shift in the bureaucratic response. Federal stimulus packages and expanded unemployment benefits were often intercepted for arrears, but many local agencies in the Great Plains implemented temporary moratoriums on license revocations for non-payment. This suggested a growing realization that crushing a father financially during a national disaster was counterproductive to the long-term goal of child stability. Step by step, we also saw the rise of the specialized parenting coordinator in rural jurisdictions. Because the courts were closed for months, high-conflict couples had no venue to resolve disputes. This led to the widespread adoption of private mediators who could rule on small issues, like where a child would spend a rescheduled spring break, in real time via video conference. For the Great Plains father, this was a double-edged sword. It provided a faster resolution than the traditional court system, but it added a new financial burden, as these coordinators often charged hundreds of dollars per hour. This created a two-tiered system of justice in the heartland: those who could afford to buy their way into conflict resolution and those who were left to wait for the backlog of the public courts, which in some Kansas counties stretched into late 2022. As we moved into 2023 and 2024, the Great Plains began to deal with the long-term psychological fallout of the pandemic. The isolation of the lockdowns had exacerbated the mental health crisis among rural men. In states like Wyoming and South Dakota, where the suicide rate for middle-aged men was already among the highest in the nation, social workers reported an increase in what they called pandemic-induced parental alienation. Because children had been confined to one household for extended periods, the reintegration of the 50-50 schedule was often fraught with anxiety and resistance. The Great Plains father of 2024 was no longer just a provider or a disciplinarian. He had to become a trauma-informed parent, navigating the complex emotional landscape of children who had spent their formative years in a state of global fear. The post-pandemic era also solidified the remote work revolution as a permanent fixture of the Great Plains economy. By 2025, a significant percentage of divorced fathers in the region were no longer tied to a specific geographic location for their paycheck. This led to a phenomenon called the Great Recentering. Fathers were moving back to their ancestral small towns to be closer to aging parents and their own children, bringing urban-scale salaries to rural communities. This shift in economic power began to change the social standing of the divorced dad. He was no longer the man who failed at farming. He was the professional who brought tax revenue and stability to the town. The stigma that had been brewing since the Victorian era was finally being overwritten by the reality of the 21st century knowledge worker. But as the social landscape improved, the legal landscape in the Great Plains began to face a new challenge: the rise of the pro se litigant. Because of the rising cost of legal representation, more and more fathers were appearing in court without attorneys. In 2025, data from the Nebraska Judicial Branch showed that nearly 60% of domestic relations cases involved at least one unrepresented party. This forced the courts to simplify their processes and create more user-friendly digital filing systems. For the Great Plains father, this was the ultimate expression of the pioneer spirit of self-reliance. He was no longer a passive participant in a system he didn't understand. He was his own advocate, armed with research and a laptop. By the start of 2026, we see a Great Plains that is unrecognizable from the era of the 1930s Dust Bowl. The father is no longer a ghost or a paycheck. He is a highly connected, legally protected, and technologically empowered co-parent. The laws of the region, once the most rigid in the country, are now some of the most progressive regarding the presumption of equal time. The journey from the sod house to the smart home has been a century-long war of attrition against distance, economics, and social prejudice. But history is never a straight line toward progress. As we look toward the final chapters of this overview, a new set of questions is emerging. As the year 2027 unfolds, the Great Plains is facing a new demographic shift. Younger generations are delaying marriage and having fewer children, while the cost of living in once affordable Midwestern towns is skyrocketing. How will the next generation of fathers navigate a world where the very definition of a homestead is changing? And what happens when the artificial intelligence and automation that built the new Great Plains economy begin to threaten the jobs that these fathers rely on to pay their support? The story of the Great Plains father is about to enter its most unpredictable phase yet, where the battle for presence meets the challenge of a rapidly disappearing middle class. In the next part, we examine the current state of fatherhood in 2026 and the emerging trends that will define the next 100 years of life on the prairie. As we stand here in the spring of 2026, the landscape for a divorced father in the Great Plains has reached a level of complexity that would be unrecognizable to the homesteaders of the 19th century. To understand the current state of affairs, imagine a father named Tyler in 2026, living in a revitalized railroad town in central Nebraska. Tyler is a remote systems analyst for a logistics firm based in Chicago. He is 34 years old, divorced for 3 years, and shares 50-50 physical and legal custody of his 7-year-old daughter. In 1826, the law would have seen Tyler as the absolute owner of his child. In 1926, he might have been a ghost fleeing a failed farm. In 2026, Tyler is a digital pioneer navigating a system that is more efficient, more connected, and yet more economically volatile than ever before. The primary shift we see in 2026 is the total integration of algorithmic child support and custody management. Historically, child support was calculated using static charts that were updated once a decade. Today, the Great Plains states have moved toward dynamic modeling. Historical trends in the mid-2020s show that states like Kansas and Oklahoma have implemented systems that account for the massive fluctuations of the gig economy. For a father like Tyler, whose income might vary by 20% month to month based on project bonuses or freelance side hustles, the potential outcomes of this new system are a double-edged sword. On one hand, it prevents the accumulation of massive arrears during lean months. On the other, it creates a state of constant financial surveillance. Every transaction is a data point in a live-streamed ledger of his parental worth. Step by step, the 2026 legal process has moved almost entirely into the cloud. The Great Plains, once defined by the physical majesty of the county courthouse, has transitioned to the virtual hearing. For a divorced dad in a sprawling state like Wyoming, this has solved the $1,000 problem of legal travel. In 2026, a father doesn't have to take 2 days off work to drive across the state for a 15-minute status hearing. He logs in from his home office. This has led to a significant increase in paternal participation in minor legal matters. Data from 2025 indicates that fathers in rural jurisdictions are now appearing in over 90% of their scheduled hearings, a massive jump from the 60% seen in the early 2000s. The barrier of distance, which the Great Plains used as a tool of exclusion for over a century, has been effectively deleted by high-speed satellite internet. However, a new economic hurdle has replaced the old ones: the Great Plains housing squeeze of 2026. As remote workers from the coasts flooded into cities like Sioux Falls, Fargo, and Lincoln, the cost of a 3-bedroom home, necessary for a father to maintain a 50-50 custody arrangement, has skyrocketed. Imagine Tyler trying to find an apartment that meets the court standards for a child's bedroom, in a town where private equity firms have bought up 40% of the rental stock. We see case studies in the 2026 Nebraska housing courts where fathers are fighting to keep their shared parenting status while living in non-traditional housing, such as converted pole barns or high-end tiny homes. The legal system, which finally moved toward equal time, is now clashing with a real estate market that makes equal time prohibitively expensive for the working class. We must also analyze the rise of the co-parenting app as a legally mandated tool. In 2026, most Great Plains divorce decrees come with a requirement to use platforms that log all communication, expenses, and scheduling. For the divorced dad, this has created a culture of extreme accountability. Historical records from the 1970s show that a father could often claim he didn't receive a message or forgot a pickup time with little consequence. Today, Tyler's entire domestic life is time-stamped and geo-fenced. If he is 5 minutes late for a transition at a gas station halfway between towns, the app records his GPS coordinates. This has drastically reduced the number of he said, she said disputes in court, but it has introduced a high-tech layer of anxiety. The Great Plains father is now a manager of a corporate-style logistics operation where the product is his child's childhood. Data from early 2026 suggests that this technological shift is having a profound impact on the mental health of Midwestern men. While physical isolation has decreased, digital fatigue has increased. Case studies from rural health clinics in South Dakota highlight a phenomenon called litigation burnout. Fathers are spending upwards of 10 hours a week managing the digital paper trail of their divorce. The potential outcomes of this are a new form of social withdrawal. We see men who are perfectly compliant with the law and highly involved with their children, yet they feel like they are living in a permanent probation period. The shame of the 1930s has been replaced by the scrutiny of the 2020s. Another critical trend in 2026 is the emergence of the silver dad on the Great Plains. As life expectancy has increased and the age of first marriage has pushed later, we see a surge in divorced fathers in their 50s and 60s who are raising young children. These men often have more financial stability, but face the challenge of a physical landscape that is still built for the young. In states like Kansas, We see the development of father-focused support networks that resemble the old agricultural cooperatives of the 1920s. These men are pooling resources, childcare, legal fees, and even communal housing to navigate the post-divorce world. This is a return to a more communal form of fatherhood that would have been familiar to the early pioneers who relied on their neighbors to survive the winter. The 2026 Great Plains Father is also the first to deal with the integration of AI-assisted mediation. In many jurisdictions, small disputes over summer vacation schedules or extracurricular costs are now first filtered through an AI mediator that uses historical case law to suggest a fair split. For a man like Tyler, this removes the emotional volatility of dealing with an ex-spouse directly. It provides a neutral, data-driven solution, but it also raises concerns about the dehumanization of the family unit. Are we moving toward a future where the heart of the Great Plains, its emphasis on human character and local community, is being replaced by an optimized algorithm? As we look at the state of the region today, it is clear that the Great Plains divorced dad has moved from the periphery of society to the center of a new social order. He is the primary consumer of the new rural economy, the most frequent user of the digital court system, and the face of the modern shared parenting movement. He has survived the droughts of the 30s, the foreclosures of the 80s, and the lockdowns of the 20s. He is more educated, more present, and more legally protected than any generation of fathers in American history. But as we prepare to wrap up this 10-part masterclass, we have to ask, what is the final cost of this evolution? We have looked at the law, the economy, and the technology, but what about the soul of the father? As we move into the final part of our deep dive, we will look at the long-term cultural legacy of the divorced dad in the Great Plains. We will explore the final synthesis of the pioneer past and the digital present. How do the stories we tell about the plains change when the hero isn't the man who stays, but the man who learns how to leave and still remain? We are heading into the final summary of the century, where we define what it truly means to be a father in the wide-open spaces of the American future. The circle is about to close, from the sod house to the digital homestead. The culmination of this century-long journey across the Great Plains brings us to a profound realization. The divorced father is no longer an anomaly of the prairie, but a central architect of its new social fabric. To synthesize everything we have covered, imagine a final character, a man named Elias in late 2026, standing on a ridge in western Nebraska where his great-great-grandfather once broke the sod. Elias represents the completion of the cycle. He is a man who has experienced the full spectrum of the historical trends we have analyzed, the legal battles of the 1990s, the economic shifts of the 2000s, and the technological integration of the 2020s. For Elias, being a divorced dad in the Great Plains is not a mark of failure, but a complex, high-stakes exercise in modern American resilience. Historically, the Great Plains was a region defined by the myth of the nuclear family as a survival unit. If the family broke, the farm broke. If the farm broke, the man was erased. But as we look at the data from 2026, we see a radical departure from this pioneer pessimism. Case studies from contemporary sociological research in the Midwest suggest that the potential outcomes for children in these highly managed, shared parenting Great Plains households are often characterized by a unique form of regional adaptability. These children are growing up with a decentralized view of home. They are as comfortable in a high-rise apartment in Des Moines as they are on a ranch in the Sandhills. The Great Plains father has effectively taught the next generation that stability is not found in a single plot of land, but in the consistency of a parental presence that transcends physical boundaries. Step by step, we have watched the legal system in states like Kansas, South Dakota, and Oklahoma move from a position of patriarchal ownership in the 1880s to maternal preference in the 1940s, and finally to the egalitarian 50-50 presumption of 2026. This evolution mirrors the changing economic reality of the plains. When the economy was based on physical labor and the home was a production site, the law prioritized the unit. Now that the economy is based on information and the home is a hub of digital connectivity, the law prioritizes the individual relationship. Elias, our 2026 father, benefits from a legal framework that recognizes his emotional utility. He is no longer just a provider of calories and shelter. He is a provider of guidance, education, and psychological safety. We must also consider the final transformation of the Great Plains landscape itself. The abandoned farmhouses that once symbolized the failure of the divorced dad in the 1930s are being replaced by the infrastructure of the digital nomad. The geographical isolation that was once the primary enemy of the divorced father has been conquered by a combination of satellite internet and the decentralized workforce. Imagine if Elias had lived in 1950. His divorce would have meant a total social exile. In 2026, his divorce is managed through an interface that keeps him integrated into his community's school boards, church groups, and local politics. The potential outcomes of this integration are a more stable rural society where the dissolution of a marriage does not lead to the dissolution of the town's population. Historical trends over the last decade show that the Great Plains has actually become a destination for divorced fathers from other parts of the country. They are drawn by the combination of progressive shared parenting laws and a lower cost of living compared to the coastal metros. This has created a new demographic of the intentional Midwestern dad. These are men who choose the plains specifically because the legal and social climate allows them to be the kind of father their own fathers were prevented from being. This is a powerful reversal of the Dust Bowl migration. Instead of men fleeing the plains because they failed, men are flocking to the plains so they can succeed as parents. As we look at the psychological legacy, we see the death of the Stoic silence. The 1930s father didn't talk about his pain. He just left. The 1980s father didn't talk about his pain. He just worked. The 2026 father in the Great Plains is part of a culture that finally prioritizes mental health and communicative co-parenting. We see this in the proliferation of father-led support networks across the region that focus on emotional intelligence and conflict de-escalation. The historical overview of the Great Plains is, at its heart, a story of the thawing of the American male. The harsh, frozen expectations of the pioneer era have melted into a more fluid, empathetic model of fatherhood that values presence over power. The data from the 2026 census provides the final piece of the puzzle. For the first time in a century, the rate of paternal involvement in non-intact households in the Great Plains has surpassed the national average. This is a direct result of the legislative battles and social movements we have tracked through this series. The region that once had the highest rates of father abandonment during times of crisis has become the region with the highest rates of father engagement. The Great Plains has turned its greatest weakness, its vast, isolating distances, into a catalyst for creating the most robust digital and legal parental networks in the world. Now imagine Elias looking out over that Nebraska ridge one last time. He sees the wind turbines spinning on the horizon, symbols of the new energy economy. He hears his phone chime with a message from his daughter, sent via their mandated co-parenting app. He is a man who is legally protected, technologically connected, and socially accepted. He is the end product of a century of struggle. The story of the divorced dad in the Great Plains is not a tragedy of broken homes. It is an epic of reconstructed lives. It's a testament to the fact that while the land may be harsh and the laws may be slow to change, the bond between a father and his child is the most resilient crop the prairie has ever produced. This masterclass has taken us through the sod houses of the 1880s, the divorce colonies of the 1890s, the dust-choked roads of the 1930s, the foreclosed fields of the 1980s, and the digital frontiers of the 2020s. We have seen how the identity of the American father was forged in the fire of domestic and economic collapse, and then rebuilt, piece by piece, through legal activism and technological innovation. We have analyzed the potential outcomes of social stigma and the historical trends of legislative reform. We have reached the end of this historical overview, but for the fathers of the Great Plains, the work of parenting in the wide-open spaces of the future is just beginning. As the sun sets on this 10-part deep dive, we have documented the transition from the master of the house to the partner in the home. The Great Plains has taught us that no distance is too great, and no law is too rigid to stop a father who is determined to stay. We have seen the evolution of the American dream from the ownership of a homestead to the stewardship of a relationship. The cycle is complete, the data is clear, and the legacy of the Great Plains father is firmly planted in the soil of the future. While this historical journey through the Great Plains has concluded, the evolution of the American family continues to face new frontiers. As we move beyond the geography of the Midwest, a new set of challenges is emerging on the horizon of the national landscape. We are beginning to see the rise of a new phenomenon, the multi-state family, where the laws of the Great Plains collide with the legal structures of the urban coasts. What happens when a 50-50 custody order from South Dakota meets a non-presumptive court in New York? The next phase of our investigation takes us out of the prairie and into the federal courtrooms where the final battle for a national standard of fatherhood is currently being waged. The story of the Great Plains was just the beginning. The struggle for a unified American fatherhood is the next great deep dive.